We're back here on WHIP, Philly's #1 college radio station. Now joining me on the phone lines is the voice of the Temple Football Owls on 1210 WPHT, in addition to the KYW sports anchor, and that's Harry Donahue. Harry, Zach Gelb here. How are you?
Okay, Zach, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great myself. A somber day yesterday in the NFL as the passing of Steve Sabol occurred at the age of 69, died from an 18-month battle of brain cancer. You worked at NFL Films for many years. Could we just get a reflection on Steve Sabol?
One of the most creative people I've ever met, Zach. He and his father, I think, are two people, bar any, that you could say are most responsible for the popularity of the NFL. And the reason is they made it entertaining, they made it fun, they made it informative. And Steve Sabol, I don't know if you ever can replace a guy like Steve Sabol.
In 1995, you went to NFL Films, and by that time, John Facenda was working there, Harry Callis was working there. They built a legacy, and they were a first-class organization. How much of an honor was it for you to work at NFL Films?
I was kind of awed, actually. What I did specifically was a very special thing on Sundays. I started out doing what they called stadium highlights, and every Sunday afternoon during the season and through the playoffs, we would produce a recap of 30 seconds or 60 seconds of what's going on around the league, feed it out by satellite every quarter, and it would be shown on the big boards, the big stadium scoreboards, in every venue. And it was kind of neat because we would send something out, within 2 minutes we would hear it being played in Green Bay or Oakland or something like that. And then I also, when the NFL decided to go online and had the NFL.com, I was the voice of highlights for the first couple of years, and eventually all that was taken over by NFL Network out in Los Angeles. So I kind of lost my position, but it was fun to get in there and spend 15 years under the roof there at NFL Film.
Well, you're a legend in this business with your work with KYW, the voice of many Temple sports, and also some golf stuff work that you do. Since 1979, when you took that job at KYW, what has been the most interesting Philadelphia story that you've covered?
Wow, that's hard to, really, I guess, capsulize. I would say off the top, the 1980 World Series championship, I had the pleasure of traveling with the team. The games were on KYW at the time. I wasn't doing play-by-play. It was Harry and Richie and Andy Musser. But I had the chance to follow them for the last month of the regular season because they were nip and tuck with the Montreal Expos in the NL East. Then that great playoff, maybe the greatest single National League Championship series ever, the Phillies and the Houston Astros, and then, of course, the World Series against Kansas City. The parade, everything about it. That had to be the highlight, I think, of what I've done in sports in Philadelphia.
It's actually funny that you did mention that as we're talking to Harry Donahue, KYW sports anchor. It's because when I was about 10 or 11 years old at Pine Forest Camp up in Greeley, Pennsylvania, we actually had a member of the 1980 world champion Philadelphia Phillies come and visit us and talk with us, and that was Gary Maddox. And I'll tell you something, Gary is one interesting guy.
Minister of Defense.
Yes, no doubt.
Gary Maddox, who covered center field better than Gary, and also a great offensive player as well. Started his career with the Giants and played with some great teams out there with Bobby Bonds, and also it was right after the Mays era. He basically was the heir apparent of Willie Mays in San Francisco. A Vietnam veteran, very interesting guy, Gary Maddox.
Since 1941, the Owls have never went up into Happy Valley or when they even hosted them and won the football game. They're looking to do that this Saturday, 3:30. It's the Temple Owls and Penn State up in Happy Valley. Montel Harris, the former BC back now with the Temple Owls. What's the status of him for this game?
Well, talking to Steve Adazio yesterday, he said he's ready to go, and I think they need him because the last game 2 weeks ago against Maryland was a situation where Matt Brown struggled, eventually got hurt. I mean, Kenny Harper is a nice backup, but we really haven't seen much of Montel Harris this season. And here's a guy, as you know, is the all-time leading rusher for Boston College. Probably, if he had stayed at BC, would have been the all-time leading rusher in the Atlantic Coast Conference. And here he is at Temple. We've already played 2 games, and I think he's had 4 carries. So I'm really anxious to see what kind of game plan they have for Montel Harris against Penn State.
So am I, because you look at Montel in that Villanova game, he had that injury and then he didn't play in the Maryland game, but you put him in the same backfield with Matt Brown. That's a nightmare matchup for most defensive coordinators.
Well, it's similar to what Temple did for a couple of years with Matt Brown and Bernard Pierce. I mean, Bernard was the big load there, and Matt was the little gnat that came in there and nobody could find him, and yet both of them, Matt was just a little under 1,000 yards. But, I mean, when you had two guys that were rushing for over 2,000 yards, that's something to give defensive coordinators nightmares. And I think Montel Harris can do that. And I also think, I mean, you may have heard Chris Coyer a little bit hinting at the fact that maybe Temple's going to unveil some wrinkles that they haven't done so far in the two games against Villanova and Maryland on offense. And the one thing I think has been missing, one glaring part of Temple's offense, and I get it because they have a new offensive coordinator in Ryan Day, but last year, Ivan Rodriguez was a great tight end, a great wing back, whatever you want to call him, H-back. He would go in motion. We would run the bootleg action with, regardless who the quarterback was, whether it was Chester Stewart, Mike Girardi, or at the end, Chris Coyer. And we would find him under coverages coming across the field, and we made him into an NFL player, as he is now with the Chicago Bears. I would like to see a little bit more of that done with Alex Jackson, who I think is a very capable receiver, or Cody Booth, whenever they're in there. We haven't seen that part of what was a very, I think, integral part of Temple's offense last season. We haven't seen that this season.
You look at that Maryland game, and one point I made on the radio leading up to that game was that Chris Coyer had to come out throwing the ball, and it was obviously evident that they didn't do that because he only had 3 attempts in the first half due to the fact, you know, you look at that Maryland secondary, it was very decimated. Similar kind of thing with Penn State. Front seven is very dominant. You mentioned Chris Coyer. Do you believe Steve Addazio has the confidence in Coyer to make the big play?
I think he has the confidence. I mean, let's face it, Chris won those last 4 games last season. He had a great bowl game, MVP in that New Mexico Bowl against Villanova. Basically, it was a pretty vanilla offense, I think, running the ball, and they accomplished that and won big. And then against Maryland, I mean, let's face it, Temple killed themselves early in that game with turnovers and penalties and field position. Nothing went right for Temple, including pass protection. And you know, Maryland, I think, started going downhill when they got all those opportunities, and they made the most of them. Having said that, it was still a 2-point game with 7.5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and it looked like, you know, the Owls, and in fact they did, I think, swung the momentum over to their side, but just couldn't finish. There were too many penalties, there were too many turnovers, and they allowed Maryland too many big plays, especially third-down conversions.
Gelb here, WHIP, Philly's #1 college radio station. We're talking to Harry Donahue of KYW. Just to note, the game this week, 3:30, will be broadcasted on 610 WIP instead of 1210 WPHT due to scheduling conflict. But you look at you look at the bye week they had. Does this give them an advantage leading into this Penn State game?
Well, Steve Addazio said yesterday, Zach, there was pros and cons to the bye week. The pros were it allowed a lot of guys who got nicked, including Matt Brown, including a guy who got nicked in the previous game like Montel Harris, and a couple of the offensive linemen. Gave them an extra week to get healthy. On the negative side of it, and I think everybody can identify with this, he's still not sure what he has, especially on offense. So the only way you're going to find out is get out under game time conditions. They didn't have that last week. He actually changed the practice routine a little bit. He said normally they would go a little bit easy. There wouldn't be that much contact. He decided, the heck with it, I'm going to go full throttle in practice. And he said he had two or three of the hardest practices that he's had in a long time in the period from middle of last week to the middle of this week, just because he wanted these guys to get as close to game conditions as possible. Look, when you have a young offensive line, that's the toughest position in the game. A lot of these guys have only played in 2 games so far. They're going up into Happy Valley in front of probably 100,000 people. Everything speeds up. Adrenaline takes over a little bit. Everybody's got to be ready to pick it up a notch. And coming off a bye week, there's inclination maybe to not be up to speed. They got to be up to speed real fast. They can't come out and let Penn State capitalize on the home field and the home crowd advantage.
And you know what I also think could be a big game story going into this game is Kevin Newsome. He was at Penn State last year. How much value is he for preparation leading into this Penn State game? I know the program has changed, but there's still some players from last year's Penn State team that's currently on the team right now.
I'm sure that coaches, if they wanted to, could pick his mind a little bit about certain tendencies of guys that are there. I mean, he and Matt McGloin actually battled for I think, a backup spot a couple of years ago before Kevin left the program. And Kevin wants to get on the field. Steve was asked that yesterday. Kevin has hinted about the possibility of maybe playing some wide receiver, for example. He's a great athlete. He's a big kid. I mean, he looks like a tight end. He's maybe the most athletic of the three quarterbacks, and I think that's saying a lot because we've seen what Chris Coyer can do. But Steve seemed to say, don't expect to see Kevin Newsome lining up out there at wide receiver because, he's one snap away from potentially being your quarterback. And it's tough to focus on doing multiple things, especially at this level of the college game, and especially going into a situation like playing Penn State. So even though Kevin would like to get out there, you admire that at another position, but you got to go with your strength, and his strength right now is being a backup because, like the coach said, one hit away from being out there as your QB.
Final one here, Harry. The big point to me in this game, which I think is going to decide the outcome of this game, if the Owls are going to be able to get the victory or not, is Matt McGloin going up against this Temple secondary. Break down that matchup for me.
That's going to be critical because they got a receiver in 3 games, Allen Robinson, who's had 24 catches and 4 touchdowns. And Robinson is obviously a big play guy. That's McGloin's favorite target. McGloin has completed 56% of his passes, 8 touchdowns. And you're right. I think, Chuck Heater is going to have to come up with a pretty good plan. Maybe have a couple guys watching where Allen Robinson is at all times. We saw Maryland with a freshman receiver, the little kid Stephon Diggs, number 1, who came in the game, played as a slot receiver. It seemed like any time they wanted to go to him, he was wide open. I think Robinson has to be considered the same kind of threat.
Harry, thanks so much. I appreciate the time. Enjoy the trip up to Happy Valley, and let's get you on again real soon, my man.
Hey, Zach, thanks very much. Enjoyed it.